Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution by natural selection in 1859. It's a stunningly simple theory by a man who arguably was the greatest theorist of the 19th century, and some might say of all time. This is all the more surprising since Darwin not only failed at school, he also dropped out of medical college in Edinburgh. When he saw his first operation on a child without anaesthetic, he fled from the theatre, unable to stomach the screams and the blood. He left the course without qualifications. His father, despairing about his son's future, urged him to become a clergyman. It seems ironic that the man who later offered an alternative explanation to the creation should take up theology at Cambridge University. But by then, Darwin had developed a passion for natural history, and when he was offered a job as an unpaid naturalist on board a survey ship, he was ecstatic. His father reluctantly agreed to let him go, and within a month, HMS Beagle had set sail. It was 1831, and Darwin was 22 years old. The hazardous journey covered 40,000 miles, during which he collected specimens of plants and animals, many of which had not been seen before. On his return, he wrote his first book, The Voyage of the Beagle, a naturalist's travel book, a classic of its kind. The journey had taken 5 long and exhausting years, and almost, as if to make up for lost time, Darwin soon married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, and together they moved to Down House in Kent and produced 10 children, all of whom he used to help formulate his theory. By this time, Darwin had begun to question the idea that animals were immutable, in other words, unchangeable. The more he looked at the specimens that he brought back, the more he questioned the minute differences between the species. Could they just be variations of one broad species who had all descended from one common ancestor? And if they did, how could it happen? No one as yet had produced a satisfactory answer. There were 2 pieces of knowledge essential before Darwin could devise his theory of natural selection. First, Charles Lyell, a famous geologist of the time, had written a book called Principles of Geology, which Darwin had read on HMS Beagle. It gave Darwin vital clues. Up until the 19th century, some people in the Western world believed that the world was very young, suggesting that it had begun in 4004 BC. By calculating back through the generations in the Old Testament from the time of Christ, 4,000 years had elapsed to the time of Adam and Eve. With 2,000 years since the time of Christ added on, this would not be enough time for evolution of species to take place. But Lyell showed that the world was not 6,000 years old, but millions, perhaps even billions of years old. During that time, the shape of its land masses and seas had changed dramatically, such as when America separated from Europe and Africa. Great Arctic ice sheets had moved mountains into plains and thick forests into grasslands. But the most important thing from Darwin's point of view was that these geological changes had taken place over millions of years. If geological change could occur so slowly, was it possible that living organisms had also undergone similar subtle changes over a similar lifespan? But still, the crucial question remained. How had animals changed? Even if there was enough time, how could plants and animals have evolved from one into another? The second piece of knowledge essential for Darwin's theory came from the famous essay written by the economist Thomas Malthus. He pointed out that soon there would not be enough food on the planet to support an ever-increasing number of people being born. Therefore, unless people practiced birth control, competition for food would inevitably lead to famine or war. This idea, Darwin realized, could also be applied to animals and plants. The oak tree, for example, produces hundreds of acorns every year. The salmon produces thousands of eggs, most of whom die. But Darwin added two further points to Malthus's idea. First, Darwin saw that it wasn't a fair lottery between who will live and who will die. Rather, those born with a tiny advantage over others will be the winners who will survive and reproduce. Secondly, Darwin also realized that these advantages would be inherited, so that more members of the next generation would possess them. Eventually, over time, every member of the species would possess that advantage. Darwin at last had the final clues as to how evolution could happen. He called it his theory of natural selection. And although it was ready in the 1830s, he was too afraid to publish it until 1859, some 20 years later. Pause the tape for a moment and see if you can work out why he might have been frightened. One reason for the delay in publishing his works was that he was presenting radical ideas to a God-fearing nation. He was denying the idea of a grand creator, or at least suggesting that you didn't need a god to explain the presence of animals. He was also suggesting that people had descended from apes. When he put forward his theory to his scientific friends, most of them rejected it as preposterous. If he couldn't convince his friends, how could he convince others? Darwin was finally spurred on to publish his theories after he received an essay from the naturalist Alfred Wallace. He had also travelled widely collecting specimens, and to Darwin's horror had independently discovered the principle of natural selection and was asking his opinion about it. There was no other option left but to publish it as quickly as possible. In 1859, Darwin's masterpiece appeared. It was a sensation, selling out on the first day and running to 6 editions during his lifetime. History has given little credit to Wallace, but there was one crucial difference between the two men. Wallace remained religious and excluded human beings from his theory. Darwin's genius was to convince others that man is just another part of evolution and not a separate creation by God.